Hi everyone, welcome back to the Australian Rotary Health podcast called The Research Behind Lift the Lid. I'm Jessica Cooper, and with us today on episode 55 is Anna Ross from the University of Melbourne. Anna was awarded an Ian Scott PhD scholarship from Australian Rotary Health from 2019 to 2021 for her project Mitigating the Impact of the Media on Stigmatising Attitudes Towards People with Severe Mental Illness. Anna's background is in psychology, where she has completed a Master of Clinical Psychology and worked clinically in adolescent mental health. She has 10 years' experience in mental health research, with her research focusing on reducing stigma and discrimination towards mental illness, mental health first aid, and suicide prevention. So welcome to the podcast, Anna. Thanks so much for joining me today. How's everything going for you at the moment?
Thanks so much for having me, Jessica. As I mentioned, just as we were talking before, I've had a look at the list of people you've interviewed for these podcasts. So we've got a lot of the leading Australian mental health experts already included in your podcast. So it's quite the honour to also be asked to join you. So thank you.
Well, it's great to have you, and I'm really looking forward to talking about your research today. And I noticed that you only just recently submitted your PhD thesis, so I just wanted to say congratulations. That must be such a huge achievement.
Thank you. Only I think just over 2 weeks ago I submitted my thesis, so it's a great feeling. But I had such an incredible PhD journey, and I'm really proud of the research that I produced during this time. And I think it has a really strong potential to reduce media-based stigma towards people with mental illness. So I'm really happy with what I was able to achieve during my PhD, and I'm also really looking forward to what happens next and the work that I can do next to create that bigger impact.
Yeah, that's so great. And I guess, what would you say was your greatest achievement while completing your PhD?
Good question. I would absolutely finishing was a great achievement. But yeah, I honestly just think, as I said, the research that I did, I think that's something that I'm really proud of, and something I really strongly believe in. And something that can have a really big impact on media-based stigma towards people with mental illness. So I'm not done yet on this topic. There's still a lot more work to be done, in the media and in reducing public stigma through news portrayals. And I'm really looking forward to continuing to do that into the future.
Yeah, it's such an important topic. And I guess, what was it that might have drove you towards this particular area specifically?
Absolutely. And that's such a great question, because I think it's a really interesting story. So previously I've, before undertaking my PhD in the Centre for Mental Health at the University of Melbourne, I was working with Professor Tony Jorm and Professor Nikki Reevely as part of their team, where stigma research is a big focus. So they've done a lot of work into reducing stigma in Australia previously. And so I guess, this project kind of came out of that. And it happened in response to noticing that there were the news reports about mental illness, particularly related to violence and crime, were still quite stigmatizing. And so what we did with our project was built on the research and the success of the work that's been done with improvements in the quality of reporting on suicide in Australia. And that research has been led by Professor Jane Purkis, who is also one of the wonderful researchers that Australian Rotary Health have supported. She's also the head of our centre as well at the university. And she's collaborated with Mindframe, who are Australia's national initiative for safe and responsible communication about mental illness and suicide, in her work to improve these portrayals. And part of that was developing media guidelines for how to responsibly and safely report on suicide, aiming to reduce the harms that can happen if it's the reporting is not done so in a responsible and safe way. And also the media training as well. So that's another way that those guidelines are rolled out to media professionals and media students across Australia. So what we did, it was very much a team effort. My PhD, I was very supported in this research, which was wonderful, really wonderful experience. So what we did was we really extended the media guidance and based our work on this suicide model. So we extended the media guidance to cover media portrayals of people with mental illness in the context of violence and crime, and then also developed and piloted media training in a really similar way to how Mindframe are doing it now. So basing it on that amazing work that's been shown to be effective in improving news portrayals.
Yeah, and that's so great that you mentioned Professor Jane Purkis and her work, because that's one of the studies that was such a success story for ARH, I think, and seeing you kind of follow on from that with other media guidelines, that sounds really important, and some great work there as well. I guess for your, could you walk us through maybe some of the main studies that made up your PhD and how you went about conducting them?
Absolutely. So my PhD was made up of 4 research studies, or 4 smaller projects that all combined to form the big research thesis. So my first study, I conducted a systematic review. So that involves looking at other people's research and then compiling that all into one research article. So all that evidence is synthesized and they're together. And what this looked at was the impact of news portrayals of people with severe mental illness on attitudes towards severe mental illness. And this then informed our next study, where we conducted key interviews with people who we considered to be key stakeholders. So that included media professionals, as well as mental health experts, including people with lived experience, as well as researchers whose work focuses on stigma and media portrayals of mental illness, which then informed the next study. Quite a nice flow on between these studies, but informed our next study, where we conducted a Delphi expert consensus study, which I guess is quite a technical term, quite a technical name. So basically what that study involves is determining consensus on a topic amongst a group of experts via a series of online surveys. And what we did with our Delphi study was develop media guidelines for responsible reporting of people with mental illness in the context of violence and crime. So as I alluded to earlier, and as I also mentioned earlier, our 4th study looked at so turning these guidelines into a media workshop. And the 4th study, we evaluated that workshop with a group of journalism students.
It sounds like it kept you very busy.
Absolutely. It wouldn't be a PhD if it didn't.
Yeah. Well, I guess could you tell us maybe about some of the most important research findings from these studies?
Absolutely. So in our review of other research that had looked at the impact of news stories about people with severe mental illness, we found that news portrayals about violent crime in particular, that was violent crime that was perpetrated by a person with a mental illness, can have quite a negative influence on attitudes towards people with a mental illness. And for example, this could increase beliefs about people with a mental illness being dangerous or unpredictable. So obviously quite a negative impact. And those kind of news stories really perpetuate stereotypes that exist about people with severe mental illness. And when I say severe mental illness, I'm talking about lower prevalent mental illnesses that involve psychotic symptoms. And that was the definition we used for my PhD. That includes psychosis, schizophrenia, and bipolar disorder as well. So we know that, that stigmatizing beliefs are higher towards people with more like severe and more poorly understood mental illnesses. And And so, yeah, we learnt also that the media can have an impact on these beliefs. So, learning this, we then conducted the interviews with our key stakeholders, where it was confirmed that there was a gap in media guidance for, responsibly reporting on incidents of violence and crime that are perpetrated by someone with a mental illness, and how to report on these stories in a way that doesn't perpetuate stigma and have a really negative impact on public attitudes. And it also came out that media resources for reporting on this topic would actually be quite useful. So from then we developed guidelines to inform responsible and balanced news reporting of mental illness, specifically focusing on the context of violence and crime. So as I mentioned earlier, there are media guidelines that already exist, and these have a real focus on safe reporting of suicide, with a little bit of guidance about reporting on mental illness, but not a lot of detail about reporting specifically on mental illness when it involves violence and crime. So that's kind of the gap that our research addressed, the gap in media guidance that our research addressed. And then we conducted an evaluation of media training that was based on these guidelines. And we did this with a wonderful group of journalism students. And we found the media training to be effective. So it was only a smaller pilot study. So it's a great, platform for more research into the future. But we found it to be effective in improving journalistic behaviours. So that was creating news reports that are more consistent with the guidelines. It was effective to improve intentions and confidence to report consistently with the guidelines. And it was also effective in reducing stigmatising attitudes towards people with a mental illness. So it's, like I said, still early findings yet, but really promising for us to explore further in future research.
Yeah, and those sound like, very, very positive findings. And I guess, do you see any potential positive implications coming out of this research?
Absolutely. So something that's already happened that's quite exciting and we're really proud of is that the guidelines, the media reporting guidelines, have already been published on the Mindframe's website as part of their suite of media guidance. So that's something we're really thrilled to have come out of this. So these guidelines are available for media professionals. Anyone can even access these guidelines freely online. So that was really exciting. And then from this, obviously it will take time for the guidelines, people to become aware of them and for that uptake to happen. And we'll need to do more work around making that happen as well. But with increased uptake, we're really hoping that they'll have a positive influence on media practice. And we are planning, like I said, that to conduct future research in disseminating the guidelines and also further evaluating the media training as well. So I said this research we've done now provides a great platform to extend on and build on what we've done.
Yeah, and it sounds like such a great resource, especially for people who work in the media. I guess what can they do to ensure that they don't participate in perpetuating this cycle of stigma?
Absolutely, good question. So my number one tip would be go to the Mindframe website, mindframe.org.au, and download a copy of the guidelines. And then you have that there for whenever you need it. But just to give a brief overview of what the guidelines recommend. So firstly, it's important to understand the impact that media portrayals can have and how they can influence public beliefs about people with mental illness. That's really important to have front and center in mind when writing news stories about people with mental illness. It's also important to report on the role of mental illness accurately. So sometimes what we see in news reports that isn't so accurate is that there's a very strong link between mental illness and a violent act. Mental illness can influence violent behaviour, particularly untreated psychosis. However, this is very rare. And more often, there are other factors that explain violence or above and beyond having mental illness symptoms. And these factors are things like having a history of violence or aggression, substance use, and not using treatment or being on treatment. So yeah, I think it's really important that when we are reporting on the role of mental illness, to make sure there's context as well provided about all relevant factors that contributed to the person's violent behaviour, to help to reduce that link that might have already been in people's minds about mental illness causing violence, which we know is not the case.
Yeah, absolutely.
Another thing, just quickly, a few more points. Important to explain legal terms to make it clear that people who are found not guilty by mental impairment are not simply just getting away with it. There's actually appropriate consequences and actions taken following. And also, similar with the mind frame guidelines for reporting on suicide and mental illness, the importance of using appropriate language. So using language that is person first, that describes someone as a person with schizophrenia rather than a schizophrenic, and doesn't sensationalize mental illness or confuse it with erratic behaviour. And finally, it's important to provide help-seeking information and links to further information about mental illness and crime. We know it might be really hard for a journalist to include in a news report the rarity of mental illness symptoms causing or being involved in violent behaviour, but maybe it might be appropriate to include a link so people can learn that information themselves.
Yeah, well, thank you. Those sounds like some really good tips, for people working in the media. So hopefully they can take that on board. I guess as well, like you mentioned that there are plans to continue on with the research that you've done with that pilot study. Is that something that's in the works now, or are there maybe some other areas that you're going to look at as well?
Absolutely. So I feel like I'm just getting started with my research in the field of, addressing media-based stigma, which is really exciting. Knowing that, I've in the work that I've done in the past few years with my PhD, there's still a lot more work I can do, and change and impact I can create. So that's really exciting. So I'm hoping to do that into the future. So absolutely, as you said, we've done a pilot trial of the media training with journalism students. So the next step for us is now to conduct a randomized control trial, which is a more rigorous evaluation of the training. And so for those who don't know what that involves as such, a randomized control trial means that we randomly allocate, we'd have clusters, so that would be journalism schools, to whether they undertake the media training or not. And so it helps to give us a control group to compare the findings over time, and helps us to work out, if the improvements we're potentially seeing from our journalism students who have undertaken the training, if that's purely due to the training or whether there might be other chance factors that are affecting those findings. So it's a much more rigorous way of working out the true impact of the media training, but also we would do this on a larger scale. So instead of just having students from one university, our goal would be to have students from universities all over Australia to get a better understanding of the impact. So that's something that we'd really love to do. And also, as I mentioned earlier, is that it's really great we've developed guidelines. However, we really need to do further work to disseminate them, to increase the uptake of the guidelines so that it can have a bigger impact on media portrayals, and subsequently improve attitudes towards people with mental illness.
Yeah, well, it sounds like you've got some exciting projects ahead of you. So that sounds really great. I guess looking forward, do you have any other sort of goals for your career?
Absolutely. And I think my big focus now is continuing to this further research. So really hoping to get funded as a postdoctoral researcher in the near future. But for now, I am really excited to continue working with my team at the Centre for Mental Health. So working with Professor Nikki Reevely and Dr. Amy Morgan, who were also my PhD supervisors, and to be conducting research into stigma and improving attitudes and understanding of people with mental illness. So I'm I'm really excited for this opportunity, but also, like you said, planning towards furthering the research in due time in the future.
Yeah, and it really sounds like such an important area as well, and something that can make a really big impact. So yeah,
Absolutely. Thanks,
it's really
Jess.
great. Our Rotary audience as well, they always like to see the impact that their donations and fundraising efforts have. Could you maybe talk about how the Ian Scott PhD scholarship may have helped you in your research career?
Absolutely. And, I think it's really important to acknowledge that research can't happen without funding. So the Ian Scott PhD scholarship has helped to make this important research done that I've done in my PhD possible. All research, including PhDs, can't happen without funding. And so, with funding being really competitive in Australia as well, it means that, a lot of fantastic research ideas don't always get funded. So the support from Australian Rotary Health is so important in getting this important research and focusing on mental health happening in Australia. But the Ian Scott Scholarship's also given me the opportunity to meet other PhD researchers who are undertaking really important mental health research as well. So it's not just myself who has benefited from the support of Australian Rotary Health and in undertaking my important research, but there's so many of us who have benefited, and this research may not have been possible otherwise. So it's been really important and essential in making this important research happen. So thank you.
Well, yeah, thank you for doing this important work, and thank you so much for joining me on the podcast and talking about your research today, Anna. It's been really great. Did you want to add anything before we wrap up?
I think you've had some really great questions, Jessica. I just wanted to echo again, thank you so much for having me. And to the broader Rotary community as well for supporting my research, but also, the wonderful mental health research that is happening here in Australia.
Oh, well, thank you again. That was the 55th episode of our podcast called The Research Behind Lift the Lid. It's always so inspiring to hear what researchers in Australia are doing to make a difference to mental health and how they are helping us on our mission to lift the lid on mental illness. If you can, please support important mental health research like Anna's by donating on the Australian Rotary Health website. Thank you for listening. Please join us again next time.